All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Jeff Mainville, Programming and Events Manager here at Hartford Public Library, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Hartford Public Library is home to the Hartford History Center, a special collections research center and museum where history always matters. Thank you. And we're dedicated to preserving over 300 years of the history and the stories of Connecticut's capital city. Hartford Public Library is redefining the role of the urban library in the 21st century, and we are more than delighted to be working with the Connecticut Forum to present this evening's program. At this time, I would like to introduce the Executive Director of the Connecticut Forum, Doris Sugarman.
Thanks, Jeff. How's everyone doing? Great, good. Thank you for coming out. We're really excited about this event in particular because it's this wonderful collaboration with Hartford Public Library. This is our second event together, and we're thrilled for the opportunity to continue the conversations that start at the forum stage at the Bushnell and bring them here to this great venue, great free venue. So thank you for being here. About a week and a half ago, on May 9th, we presented our last forum of the season, a conversation between David McCullough and Stacy Schiff. Were any of you there? Awesome, thanks. It was an amazing evening, very, very memorable. Tonight, so before we tackle the question, does history matter, I'd like to share some food for thought, a few video highlights from our forum evening with Mr. McCullough and Ms. Schiff. Enjoy the clip.
One thing you told high school students we talked to today, I can't remember which one asked you a specific question about being a historian, and you said you didn't consider yourself a historian, you consider yourself a writer.
I do. But I'm writing about what really happened, about real people. And you can't make anything up. You can't juggle the facts or statistics. You can't say what they said unless you know they said it on paper or in a speech or in a testifying in court or whatever. And the truth is often very much stranger and more interesting than fiction. And some of what happens in real life, or history, if you choose to call it that, no novelist would dare put in a novel because no one would believe it. Their editor wouldn't let them get away with it. Imagine, for example, having Jefferson and Adams die on the same day. And the day is the 4th of July. No.
It's just a little too perfect.
It's just corny, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, for a while we used to think that what a biographer did was to look through the bottom drawer of every family dresser for the outtakes, the pictures that they didn't put in the photo album. Because in the photo album, everyone's always happy and smiling. No one ever has a tantrum or a fight or chicken pox. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the unattractive moment, the discordant moment, the thing that somebody wanted to forget, the thing he was too embarrassed to record, the hesitations, John Adams in Paris not being able to speak French, whatever the thing is that somehow jars the character. And that's really where you see the character. And that's what I think is lost in all the self-publicizing.
Why is history important? What does studying about history teach us?
Well, for one thing, it has a lot to do with our role as citizens of in this kind of democracy, in this kind of society. And I think also it fosters much respect and gratitude for those who went before us, who provided so much that unfortunately, we take for granted. And it gives us a feeling that we ought to measure up too. And that we can learn a great deal from these people, not just about politics and the law and government, but about life, about being a good human being. History is about people. History is human. And it's a marvelous antidote to the hubris of the present. When you see what these people did against great odds or adversity. When you read about what they went through to make it work to our benefit, and people walk around, particularly some of our political people, with this great sense of patriotism and the love of country, and don't know anything about the history of our country. It would be like being in love with a woman or a man, and you have his picture all around the mirror, or her picture all around the mirror, and you have no idea where she grew up, where she went to school, who her parents are, how she got to be the way she got. And to me, it's as if you have no interest in people. And people are the most interesting subject there is. There's no excuse for history ever to be boring. No excuse for that.
There was some poll in the New York Times that listed these two as the best historians living today, and we had the opportunity to spend the evening with them. What a treat! And now we get to spend an hour or so with some of our own leading historians in this area. So I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator. She is the class of 1958 Distinguished Professor at Wesleyan University, where she teaches in the English department, chairs the African American Studies program, and is director of the Center for African American Studies. The focus of her teaching and research is African American and New England literary history and culture, 18th and 19th century African American memory, as well as the politics of identity, faith, and privilege in colonial and antebellum America. Please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator, Dr. Lois Brown.
Good evening. Well, I'd like to invite our panelists to join me here, and I will then introduce them. So, 3 panelists. So with us today, we have Madelyn Colon, policy consultant and former assistant state treasurer who has deep roots in Connecticut. A native of Hartford, she became passionate about her own history while researching Hartford ethnic history while she was in high school. She attended Northwest Catholic High School, attended Wesleyan University in Middletown, and majored in history with a concentration in Latin American history. At Wesleyan, she also worked with fellow Latino students to enhance the Latin American Studies program there, which is thriving, and she was also a proud member of Ajua Campos, the Latino Student Association. Madelyn returned to Hartford after graduation, and she has built a formidable and inspiring career in public service. She was the first woman to head the Hartford Redevelopment Agency, and she was tapped by State Treasurer Denise Napier for the post of Assistant State Treasurer. She is an expert in community development, and she has managed several public sector programs with strong results, and she is now a private policy consultant. To her right, we have Charles Teale Sr., former chief of the Hartford Fire Department, where he served with distinction for 27 years and established a national reputation for his empathetic leadership. Chief Teale holds a bachelor's degree in human services from Springfield College and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Hartford. Since retiring as chief of the Hartford Fire Department, he has taught reading and math fundamentals at the Caribbean Resource Center. He has tutored adult education students at the Hartford Adult Education Center in reading, writing, math, and science. And he also has served as president of the Board of Trustees at the Connecticut Historical Society and served on the advisory board of the Hartford History Center. He's the recipient of many awards and is most recently the author of a compelling biography and oral history of his childhood mentor, Walter Doc Hurley, He was a legendary teacher who dedicated himself and the foundation that bore his name, and still does, to providing scholarships to hundreds of Connecticut students. To Chief Teale's right is Dr. Walter Woodward, Connecticut State Historian, Associate Professor of Early American History at the University of Connecticut. He teaches American environmental history, public history, and honors courses in American studies, especially one that focuses on the Connecticut River, as well as courses in Connecticut history. He is the author of the award-winning book, Prospero's America, John Winthrop Jr., Alchemy, and the Creation of New England Culture, as well as numerous articles on New England history. He's a regular columnist for Connecticut Explored magazine, and he recently co-authored Teaching History with Museums, Strategies for K-12 Social Studies, along with Professors Alan Marcus and Jeremy Stoddard. So before we begin, I also want to note that we are joined in spirit by another panelist who was taken ill and is not able to be with us this evening. So Anne Farrow would have been here. I think she's really here with us in spirit tonight. And we'll talk more about her own work, but she, many of us know as a journalist at the New England newspaper of record, the Hartford Courant, and she began to explore New England's relationship with enslavement in 2002 with colleagues at the Courant, and that work evolved into the work Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, which she co-authored, and her newest book, Logbooks, Connecticut Slave Ships and Human Memory, and it was published last fall by Wesleyan University Press. She's now a freelance writer. She's specializing in work with museums in Connecticut and working on a number of projects that will inspire us anew. So we'll now turn ourselves to our panel discussion. All right, good evening, panelists.
Good evening.
So I wonder if we might start with a brief introduction, a little bit about the project that you're working on now and the way in which it inspires you to think about history. Would you like to start, Madelyn?
Well, in addition to my consulting business and public policy, I'm also substitute teaching in the Simsbury school system and for one of the CREC schools. And I find it to be really fascinating. You certainly don't get rich substitute teaching, but you do get a wealth of experience. I've had the opportunity to substitute teach for third graders, eighth graders, high school students, and I'm just amazed at what I'm seeing in terms of the depth of the academic experience and the exposure that students have today as a result of technology to the world and to history.
Great, thank you. Chief?
Well, it's difficult to put in just a few words the things that I'm trying to stay involved with at this point in time. Actually, my most recent publication, book published is a book called Chief Teale's The Tools of Learning from GED to Master's Degree and Beyond. It's a system of learning, understanding, and remembering information that I created throughout my career in the Hartford Fire Department. I actually began working on this in June of 1982. That's relevant in this sense. Not only am I busy trying to promote that, but I'm also giving presentations on the information that's within it. But the reason why it is relevant to this evening is because the entire program consists of 20 different methods by which to learn, understand, and remember information. And the grand finale of this presentation is called Learn, Understand, and Remember Your Positive History. And the reason why I added that is because at one time I was referred, and you just did talk very briefly about Doc Hurley, but Walter Doc Hurley was a mentor of mine who sent me to see a man by the name of Bill Edmonds to get started on getting an education. I had dropped out of high school, been out of high school for years. And Bill Edmonds, when he heard what I had done, he was an educator at the Greater Hartford Community College, now Capital Community College. Bill Edmonds slapped his hand on his desk and he said, do you know how many people spent their lives, risked their lives, and sometimes gave their lives so you could have the opportunity to succeed? And when he said that to me, I suddenly felt like an ingrate. And I've been hearing those words, and I mean this literally, at least every day of my life since he told them to me, and I was 18 years old. And I think this is that's relevant because obviously we're going to talk about history and its importance. And that's how history became important to me, because I did know who spent their lives. I just didn't see the connection at the time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I love Chief Teale's description of history. It's similar to David McCullough as something that inspires. He was inspired by a mentor who reminded him of the sacrifices that gave him opportunity. Without that understanding of the past, you know, who knows where your motivation would have come from. I find that history can also inform in really interesting ways, that the past can provide great insights into the present because it's not the present. Right now I'm working on a project that examines the influence of rumor and what I call distorted communication in early New England. And I came to this because I was asked to do a speech at a conference discussing wars between Native Americans and Anglo settlers in colonial New England. I looked at the Pequot War. The Pequot War was the first major Anglo-Indian conflict in New England. It took place in 1637. It involved the Pequot Indians and their allies against English soldiers from Connecticut and Massachusetts and their allies. The war itself was very short. It started in May and was effectively over by fall. But what I found when I was doing the research is that both Native communities and English communities throughout Massachusetts and Connecticut stayed on complete war alert and mobilization for the next 2 years. And literally for the next 40 years, they always expected that war to break out again. Much of the impetus behind that was rumor and different kinds of rumors that affected the way people thought, and it created an environment in which there was total mistrust and people were always looking over their shoulders. I was interested in this because of an unusual question. Why, after a short war that took place in a very concentrated area, did 2 colonies and multiple tribes stay on a war footing for years and years? That led me to the subject of rumor. And then, you know, as I'm working on this, in the background are all of the current conflicts we're having. In some ways, rumor propelled violent confrontations all across America. And I find that my study of rumor in the 1600s is informing the way I think about the rumor issues of today. And that, I think, is the magic of the study of history for me.
Well, let's build on this idea of the magic of history. So David McCullough says history is really writing about what's real, about what happened. And I'm wondering if you could each speak to this idea of what you imagine is the work of history, right? We have in common our love of teaching, right? Each one of you is a teacher, and you are on the front lines of that. And you go in and you say, I'm here to talk about history. What is it that you imagine that your students hear when you say that term history, and where is it that you try to take them?
I think what you can do, and I think it always goes back, it seems to always go back to that special teacher, you know, that really inspired you. You know, in my case, it was a teacher in high school, it was actually my husband, who inspired me to understand my own history. And that, I think, developed into a lifelong passion for understanding the Puerto Rican woman and the Latin American woman in the context of the history of Puerto Rico and the history of Latin America. And so I would say what it did for me is that it instantly transported me to my roots. And my roots really were not the roots of a Puerto Rican girl that was born in Hartford and was growing up in Hartford, in the 50s and 60s, you know, but it was a Puerto Rican girl in Puerto Rico, you know, and I could really be part of that history at any point. I could be part of that history when the Taino Indians were there. I could be part of that history when Spain colonized Puerto Rico. I could be part of that history when I came to the United States, like Esmeralda Santiago in her great book when I was Puerto Rican. So it just transported me wherever I wanted to go.
Powerful. Thank you. Thanks, Chief.
The students that I tutor and teach primarily nowadays are adult education students. And I'm talking about the learning institution that I'm more likely to be at is the Hartford Adult Education Center, which is at 110 Washington Street. To give you a sense of the importance of the place, the city of Hartford has 95,000 adults, and 27,500 of those adults do not have high school diplomas. So many of them end up at the Hartford Adult Education Center trying to get a start on getting an education through the National External Diploma Program or their GEDs. And in the tutoring center today of where I work part-time, I spoke with a student from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, from Togo. To be very honest with you, I had never heard of Togo until today, but from Togo, and also from Ghana, all three from Africa. So when I talk with people about history, and I always do share with them something about history, they often give me their opinion of what history is and what they've learned already. And it's amazing how much they've learned before they even came into this country. And what I get concerned about is, well, they develop these misconceptions based upon what they've already learned and what they see on the news. So I try to give them a perspective that they can benefit from. When I talk about learning the positive history, I'm not just referring to the history of your city or your state. I'm talking about national history and world history. And I sometimes share with them, usually, I share with them the work of men like William Wilberforce and his 50-year quest to end slavery, which he reached 3 days before he died, throughout all the British colonies. I mean, these are things that I want them to receive so that it does not, to put it bluntly, I don't want them to have a negative opinion of large groups of individuals here in the United States. They're new to the United States. I want them to have a positive opinion of us. And with that positive opinion, I use the acronym FAB, and it stands for Focus, Attitude, and Behavior. If you focus on the positive things that have happened throughout history, your attitude will be positive, and it's attitude that drives behavior. And that'll carry a long way, educationally and professionally.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I have this interesting portfolio. I'm the state historian of Connecticut. And I see it as my mission to really both promote the history of Connecticut, which is undertaught in Connecticut schools, and to really encourage everyone to know the state's history and to appreciate the state's history. I think two things happened. Leo Tolstoy said that all history is autobiography, and I think most of us are drawn to history in the beginning as a way of understanding our own past. We want some family connection, and I think often that's the initial hook. We live in a global village now, and I think most people, when they stretch out for a broader history, they look at larger American history or even global historical movements, which leaves open this question: why should you care? Why should you take the time to teach schools or to know, as a citizen of this state, the history of this state, especially if your family only came here last year or 10 years ago? Why should you care about the Pequot War or the early colonial settlers or Prudence Crandall or Nathan Hale? And the thing that I try to excite students about, because I believe it's so true, is that every bit of the history of this state is yours by virtue of the fact that you live here. Both the good and the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. And not only is it yours as an interesting story, but it's yours as something that impinges upon your existence every single day. Walk around any street in Hartford and look at the buildings. You'll find buildings that were built 20 years ago, buildings that were built 80 years ago, buildings that were built 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Each one of them was built at a specific time in a specific place to meet a specific need. And over the years, those needs have evolved. Some have faded away, some have gotten stronger, but each has left a small influence, not just on the way Hartford looks, but on the way it acts and works. The past affects our lives, things that we never think of influence what we can do and how we live in monumental ways. And the way you learn that is by appreciating the different historical stories that lead to us and lead to today. If you live in Connecticut, most of the things that will influence your day-to-day existence happened right here in Connecticut, from the place where this building works to the river that flows right down the street. All of those things led to Hartford being in this place. A very quick example. Yesterday, or Monday, there was a groundbreaking next door for the new University of Connecticut campus in Hartford. It is going to be attached to and built on the Hartford Times building, the vestige of one of the most important newspapers and one of the most important buildings in Hartford's history. It was also one of the most conservative papers that was ever published for many, many years. Now, we could build the campus and you could walk in and you could say, well, what a nice old facade you've got. It's really nice. But I want people to understand that when you stand on that portico, that's the place where President Kennedy came to speak just before his election. There's a whole history behind this building. There's a reason we're here, and as a student, it's yours. All of this rich history, this tapestry, you own it. Good for students, good for adults, and come take one of my Connecticut history courses.
We're ready to enroll. The comments that you've just made really bring home to us the idea that history is visible. And certainly in a state like Connecticut, where there are so much visible history, but it's again, what are the connections that we make when we behold a particular site? So I want to just turn the question to you both, Chief Teale and Ms. Colon. Is there a specific site? Is there a place that you really see history writ large? When you think of history in Connecticut, is there a spot for you, a site, a statue, a building, something that you connect with that really inspires?
It's probably Hartford in the 1950s, and it's probably Front Street. When my mother and father came here, my mother was married in Puerto Rico, and she was 20 and came to Hartford actually the same day she was married, and went to an apartment on Front Street that had been prepared for her. And she lived there for a number of years, and we weren't born there. We were born in other neighborhoods in Hartford, but that place really was the start of my history, because it was the start of my family's migration to Hartford, into the United States, and that place. So I would say it's the city of Hartford.
Okay, great, thanks.
The place that I find to be most inspiring that just comes to mind, I'm fortunate in the sense that periodically I get a chance to, I get a chance to give a history tour of the city of Hartford. And when I find myself at the location of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, I think that's the place that I find to be most inspiring. And I find myself able to talk about the work she did. Apparently she She wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in Brunswick, Maine, not when she lived in Hartford, but it still is very inspiring to know that she did reside there and the work that she did. And I tend to share with people the thoughts that she had, the words she had after she was, in a sense, accused of starting the Civil War. And she literally is remembered as saying, she said, "I wrote what I did because as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and brokenhearted with the sorrows and injustice that I saw. As a Christian, I felt the dishonor to Christianity. And as a lover of my country, I trembled at the coming day of wrath." End of quote. Now, obviously, this is a woman who, not only was she brilliant, she had to be very courageous during that time period. Obviously, writing what she wrote, she was in danger, but she couldn't stand another moment. So I try to share that place with people more so than anything else. That's what I find most inspiring.
And this idea now, too, that people are motivated, that there's a courage that comes with telling stories, or as David McCullough said, telling the truth, sharing the details of what life really was like. And I wonder if we could step into Connecticut classrooms for a moment, right? One of the things that we do know is that history is evolving slowly as a discipline that is being taught. There are new resources, certainly the digital archives that open up a whole set of worlds to students. But I wonder if you might reflect with our audience about your own experience in a history classroom as a student. What was that like? Just think back, step back. Not so long ago, right? But at that moment when you first encountered history as a student, and then we'll make the leap to now and think a little bit about the classrooms in which our students are now learning history and what might have changed. And then we'll step into the ideal history classroom. Would you like to start, Walter?
Me?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think back to my earliest history classes. And it's interesting. The one thing you always hear, and it's absolutely true, is love of history comes down to one great teacher. Mm-hmm. And I did have one teacher. I loved history before I got to graduate school. But I was an undergraduate English major, but I had decided to become a historian. When I got to graduate school, there was one teacher who could make complex issues exciting and make the past vivid and alive. And it's that ability to engage a student, make that connection, and then make it alive for you that hooked me for good. And I'm going to pass this on because I can't remember specifics of what he did, but I'll never forget him.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
I think it was books. I think it was the impact that books had on me. I remember in high school that I read La Vida, which was that anthropologist Oscar Lewis wrote about the culture of poverty, and it was about poverty in Puerto Rico. And I remember when I read it, and I was just fascinated reading it, but I had a very conservative aunt from Puerto Rico who, when she found out that I read that book, she was just mortified. It's like, how could you read that? That's so biased. That's not what we're like. And, I think that's when that's when I realized that, history can be problematic in that sense because people can really disagree, about what is being said.
The first history teacher that I remember is a teacher by the name of Mrs. Vasquez. Mm-hmm. She was my 5th grade history teacher, and I remember her very clearly because she was the one who told all of us that Negroes used to be slaves in the United States of America. And we were angry with her. We were actually angry with her, but she explained as clearly as she possibly could, and we understood as well as we could. She's also the teacher that she brought us on so many history tours, literally. The old State House, State Capitol, State Library, Mystic Seaport, Old Sturbridge Village, and she even brought us to see The Sound of Music. But I remember her fondly now, but she's the one who had to break it to us, that news to us, that African Americans used to be slaves in the United States. That's what I remember.
There is that moment when we think about what can happen in the classroom. Do you have any perspectives on the on the ways in which teaching of history is happening now in our classrooms and for the better?
I'm concerned. I don't really know if history is being taught in our classrooms, or at least a sufficient amount. And if so, at what level is history being taught? I'm very, very concerned. I don't see a lot of it, and sometimes it frustrates me because it's the subject I'd like to discuss more than anything else. And I've been tutoring now for 4 years and haven't had a chance to tutor anyone in history, not a single soul. Science, certainly a lot of math, English, particularly when it comes to writing and a lot of reading, but I just don't know how much history is being taught in our schools.
I think there's a danger to the way history is taught when there's a move away from the lies of history and the bias of history to make it more palatable. And I'll give you an example that just happened recently. I was recently teaching an 8th grade social study class, and there was a chapter and in their textbook, and I looked at it, and it was comparing Puerto Rico and Cuba, a comparison of Puerto Rico and Cuba for 8th graders. And I read through it. It was very short. It was only 2 or 3 pages. And it was very PC in the sense that it was really trying to be fair, but it really was suggesting somehow that because of the United States' involvement in Puerto Rico, that somehow Puerto Rico was better off as opposed to Cuba. And I think that you need to be careful that you don't bring that kind of PC bias into the way history is taught.
I mildly disagree. I have a very solid belief about what history teaching at its best can do, and I think there's a lot of history that is taught now that errs both on the side of political correctness and on the side of pointing out shortcomings. We live in a country where people yell at each other from across the room. We don't discuss issues anymore. We don't work toward the important compromises that are going to happen if this country will heal its divisions and move forward. Part of that comes, I think, because even in education, education has in many ways become politicized. There's one camp of people who say, you've got to teach the positives. This is about American greatness and American exceptionalism and how good we are, and if you've got a bad story, you better just soften it over. That's what you were talking about, and that's dangerous. It is equally dangerous to completely ignore any position another side says, to point out shortcomings. What I try to do in my classes, and we structure courses so that they do this and they're very productive, so I will have students write papers and have them present the strongest argument they can for the position they believe the historical research that they've done leads them to. Then I have them turn around and write the opposite. I want them to see, we talk about teaching multiple perspectives and how useful it is to see the other side of a person's argument. But in our classrooms, we don't make that happen. If we are going to move forward as a nation, we've got to figure out how to understand that the person who disagrees with us is not an idiot or an evil person, but a person with a perspective very different from ours, and we must work together to move forward. History can do that, but I believe we have to teach it this way, not soft-soaping anything, not hiding from negatives, but seeing that bad things and good, the same thing can be interpreted as bad and good, or bad and acceptable, and still you can find a way to move forward and make things better.
Okay.
It has just dawned on me that we're thinking or talking about 3 different groups of educational levels. I didn't catch that at first. And I think a lot of it depends upon which group you're referring to. My main experience when it comes to teaching and tutoring is with adult education students. I mean, they're literally, at the youngest, they're 19 years old, and some of them are as old as 65. But it's a different group from, someone in the 8th grade or someone who is in college, working on a degree. It's a different type of dynamic. So I think you have to estimate the situation and determine a course of action depending upon the audience. Yeah, you have to be careful.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the ways in which we learn history and relearn. And I think some of the terms and possibilities that you're suggesting here, Walter, also take us to that conversation of how do we, what stands as the canon? And is the canon always the reference point? How do we expand our sense of what history is and has been? And what becomes not just supplemental to the canonical history or to the history that exists for so many people, but what really takes on and expands that sense so that it's certainly a more inclusive, but more expansive and more enriched and more informed. So I'm wondering, where do we learn history, right? So certainly the classroom is one place, right? But I wonder if we could begin to talk a little bit, and Madelyn, you have shared about the ways in which family has been so central to you, and that the public sphere, in a way, is the big classroom for you. How else do we learn history, and how else do you see students that you're encountering? Where do they learn history?
I'd say it's historical fiction. I think historical fiction is just a great way for students to understand history. And, I love historical fiction, and I love, Isabel Allende has a great quote about fiction. She says that the biggest lies in fiction will still reveal the truth, or something like that. And I guess I'm a big believer in that, because I think that historical fiction, and that's why I'm not a historian really, because facts are facts are facts, but historical fiction doesn't have to all be facts to still teach you about history.
Okay, all right. What happens in those moments, though, when we have a partial history, when we don't perhaps know as much as we want to, and now we're venturing into the world of fiction and ascribing dialogues and feelings and ideas and exchanges? Are we getting into murky territory there?
I think it depends on how serious you are. I mean, in college, I learned about the impact of race in Latin America, and what a huge impact that was, and that really inspired me to get further into that, to really try to understand that. And then that helped me to understand a lot. It helped me to understand a lot about, modern day racism in Latin America, by looking at the history, in those countries, and the importance of race, the impact of race.
So it's a combination. It's the reading of historical fiction, the reading of history and policy and politics and culture and anthropology, and then pooling all that together that enriches your sense of what the past has been.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, Chief?
Can you restate your original question?
Thinking about where we learn history. So the classroom, more traditionally defined is that place within a school where students go for a particular amount of time. But clearly, the world is the classroom. I'm just wondering about what parts of the world you see your students, your learners, finding historical narrative and historical truths and possibilities.
For me, and I have to refer to my personal experience because I'm very fond of this. My first history teachers were my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, Pearl Wood Smith and Benjamin Smith. And they were from Plains, Georgia. My great-grandparents moved up here from Plains around 1913. And my grandmother, Pearl Wood Smith, would tell me what Hartford was like in the 19-teens, 1920s, et cetera. I'd always ask her, you know, tell me about Hartford in the olden days. And she would tell me everything, things that I found impossible to believe, like horse-drawn fire trucks. I'd say, Grandma, a horse can't pull a fire truck. You know, she said, yes, they wouldn't. The fire trucks didn't look the same, but she would tell me stories like that, and she would tell me stories. But in any event, I learned from my grandparents. One person, my grandfather, however, when he heard her telling stories that were the positive stories about the city of Hartford, he'd have to come in and tell us, my cousins and I, about the negative things, the way they were in the South and Jim Crow South. So I got to learn the positive things about the state of Connecticut, particularly the capital region, because they worked as laborers and on the tobacco fields, you know, throughout this area. And I fell in love with the area because of that. And that's why when I was asked the question, do you know how many people spent their lives, risked their lives, et cetera, I could relate to it because my grandparents used to tell me things. And one of the things that, and I'll try to make this brief, but this was during a time when Garden Street had a large white population. And one of my cousins, and you've got to envision us, you know, 14 years of age and less. I mean, the youngest was about 5, and it's about 15 of us in the living room. And one of my cousins said, there sure are a lot of white people in this neighborhood. And one of my older cousins said, they're not white, they're Jewish. And I said, well, what's the difference? And another cousin said, be careful, whatever you do, don't let Grandpa hear you saying something bad about Jewish people. The next thing I knew, I felt the floor groan and him walk into the room hollering, who's in my house talking bad about Jewish people? And we were like, we weren't talking bad about it, he wouldn't hear it. He just yelled, I don't want to hear it, I said. But I came to find out why. I'm trying to wrap this up very quickly, too late for that. But I came to find out why he was so adamant about that. He said, don't talk about, you know, badly about Jewish people in my house. When they first moved here in the 19-teens, the only people who would give them jobs and a place to stay are the Jewish people. So what I'm simply saying is this. When you get that lesson from your grandparents, it stays with you. I'm 60 years old, well, I will be this month. But I haven't forgotten that experience. I was about 7 at the time. Never forgot it.
That's a powerful story. Thank you. I wonder if you would share a little bit.
Well, let me take a little perspective. Books, fiction is a great teacher. Family is, in many ways, the best teacher. Of course, classrooms are great teachers, but the people that are most trusted as teachers of history in America today are the museums. They've done survey after survey, and the institutions that people trust more than college professors, television, historical fiction, or even friends are history museums. That's not always warranted, but it's always true. And so what I have done, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about UConn coming to Hartford, is we are surrounded by these fabulous cultural institutions. What I've been doing in college classrooms for the past 5 years is completely refiguring my courses to make them externally focused, experiential, museum-based history teaching courses where students study and learn by going. Museums have for a long time, they've been evolving their view of how they teach history because they used to be the authority. And they would tell you what you should know, and you went and you drank the Kool-Aid and went away or ignored it. What they've learned is that you can tell people what they should know. They're going to come to your exhibit and walk away with what they learned from it that they think is important. So now museums are inviting the visitors to help curate, to help tell the story, to help create the histories that they teach. There's a magnificent example of this that opened on Monday at the Connecticut Historical Society. It's called Connecticut 50 Objects, 50 Stories. 39 of the 50 objects aren't from the Connecticut Historical Society's collections. They're either from other museums around around the state, or they're things that people wrote into a website and said, this is a Connecticut story that needs to be told. It's not a comprehensive Connecticut story, but this is a history of Connecticut curated by us. It's a wonderful, I would encourage all of you to see it while it's up and to think of what the next 50 objects could be and what your 50 objects might be. History from institutions is a great way to learn, and sharing the authority over what constitutes history is the next big step forward in our field, I think.
The power of questions is really key to the work that we do, whether we identify as historians, teachers, writers, curators, stewards, but the question is key. And thinking a little bit about the questions that we would want children to ask, or that we would want college students to ask, that we would want all those who are thinking and working their way towards a really rich sense of the world in which they live. Is there one kind of question that you want to ask? And certainly this idea of being in a museum, it's not a static experience. And certainly patrons now are going in and saying, I want to know about this, I want to know more about this. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the questions that motivate you in the work that you do. Often, I know that sometimes when we come to a project, some of the most fundamental questions are the ones that we ask at the very end, right? It may not be the, well, when was so-and-so born and when did so-and-so pass away? That might be the very last thing that you find, because that's not the question that gets you started. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about a project that you've worked on and a set of the questions, or one or two of the questions that really motivated you and perhaps bothered you and made you uncomfortable and pushed you to press on with the project. Because we don't always come to the project out of a sense of, well, I need to answer this particular question. There's something else. We're motivated and we're curious. In some ways, we don't have the full answer. So I'm just wondering about the kinds of questions that you ask in the work that you do.
I think it's an understanding of your roots. I mean, I think that's what my personal history has done for me, is that it's given me roots, you know, and I think that's so important for kids to really understand their roots. And I think that it's just so powerful because, you know, if you're poor, or, you know, if you have not had a good education, or if you are, you know, disenfranchised in some way, I mean, to understand that you come from a great, great continent historically, and a great group of people, and that, you know, your native language is so rich, and I mean, it's just a really powerful enforcer.
And it even, on the flip side, right, even if you have all the benefits of wealth and privilege, to ask the questions about, how did I come to be in this place? Who came before me? What is the story? What have those stories been? It's just that curiosity about who made me and how have I arrived at this particular spot. Yeah, Teale?
I think the most compelling question that I've ever been asked is one that I asked when I was a child of my grandmother. A little background on this. Around 1964, my cousin, Juanita Drayton, changed schools. And the school she went to was on Westland Street in Hartford, and she was going to a school on Barber Street, a couple of blocks away. And she was telling my grandmother this story. She said, hey, Gramps, we changed, and she called her Gramps. We changed schools this week, and we had to carry our own tables and chairs and desks, which is interesting. I don't think you get kids to do that nowadays. But my grandmother said, you changed schools, where's your new school? And she said, it's on Barber Street, it's called the Freddie Wish School. And it's actually called the Fred D. Wish School, but she said the Freddie Wish School. And my grandmother said, they shouldn't have built that school there, that's where the circus fire was. So I stood up, I couldn't have been any older than 9 years of age, and I walked into my grandmother's kitchen, and I asked a question that every young person, and we've had to share this story with many explorers, young people who want to become firefighters, ask it the same way. There was a circus fire? And that question, it's amazing how many experiences I have had because of that one question. I mean, it's caused me not to just research it. Yes, I've had to do that and read about it, many books, and interact with many individuals, but the lessons, I really can't epitomize. I can't tell you.
Will you tell us a little bit about the circus fire?
Yes, you know, that's a bad assumption on my part. July 6, 1944, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus came to the city of Hartford. And on Thursday, during the matinee, a fire was set. It depends on who you talk with. I mean, most fire professionals will tell you that it was intentionally set by a man by the name of Robert Seegee. He was not a man at the time, he was only 14 years old. But the aftermath of the disaster included 167 people, I beg your pardon, more than 167 people losing their lives. And I'm very careful about that because I was chastised by a woman once. I actually said that 168 people lost their lives here. And during the aftermath of the dedication ceremony that we had for the memorial, which is at the site of the circus fire, a woman walked up to me and she told me, she said, "You say that 168 people died here." She said, "That's not correct as a result of what happened here." She said, "My brother was so badly disfigured by what happened here that he couldn't go anywhere. He was only 10 years old, and by the time he turned 25, he knew that his life would be meaningless because he was so badly disfigured by the fire. He pointed a gun to his head and pulled the trigger." So she said more than 168 people lost their lives as a result of what happened here. So just getting back to that question, the question that comes to my mind most is, you know, there was a circus fire. It's just the two words don't seem to belong in the same sentence, circus and fire. But.
And your story really underscores that it's the power of the asking. It's not framing a question that's in the form of a dissertation. It's not trying to figure out the answer before you get to the question. It's being present and asking and being ready to hear.
If I had not asked the question, I probably would have never learned what transpired. And learning what did take place carried me into my career. And at one point, I was reading one of Wilson Faude's books. Yeah, and I was in the firehouse at one of the watch desks, brand new firefighter, and one of the guys on the job said, "What are you reading, kid?" And he grabbed the book out of my hand. That's the way firefighters treat each other. And he looked at it and he goes, "Oh, yeah, I remember this, I remember that." He goes, "Oh, there's a circus fire." And he said, "The captain was there." And then I said, "The captain? Captain who?" And he said, "What captain who?" He said, "The only captain in the house." And he talked about a man by the name of Bill Sierra. So I said, "I'm going to go talk with him." He said, "He won't talk about it." I said, "He'll talk about it with me." We had that kind of a relationship. And I asked him, I said, "Cap, were you at the circus fire?" You know, those kinds of questions. And he went into detail as to what it was like, and yeah, he was there. Yeah.
And later you were involved in setting the memorial?
Yeah, I served on the committee to build the Circus Fire Memorial. We took about 3 years to build it, and it was completed, for goodness sakes, the exact year will not come to me. I think it was 2005 we actually finished it. Yes, it's 2005 that it was completed. And I still look in on the memorial periodically. It's right behind the Fred D. Wish School at 350 Barber Street. To be exact about it, the school was not built where the circus tent was. It was built to the west of it because we, through the Metropolitan District Commission, were able to identify exactly where it was. And the most prominent part of the memorial is where the center ring was. And over 750 people contributed to the building of that memorial. But it's quite a subject to discuss. We can only, you know, hit the surface of it at this time. Affected this area for since then.
Thank you for that window, giving us a chance to look back on that past. And it prompts us, too, to think about the stories that are in plain view. So the memorials, lots of fountains, lots of statues, and we might drive by them, but if we ever have a chance to actually walk around them and to read the inscriptions and then ask the next question, who was here, who was that, when did it happen, and make other connections. I wonder if we might think a little bit about the ways in which we bring, let's as we move ourselves towards our Q&A, let's think a little bit about what we want to be responsible for learning. What is it that we think we should know? And the kinds of assignments that we give ourselves and that we want to encourage students, whether it's in a formal assignment or it's just a general conversation. Are there parts of our history that you think that we have yet to truly claim? And if the answer is yes, I wonder if you might take a moment to say a little bit more about what it is that you think we have yet to bring in to full view and have full-bodied conversations about in and beyond the classroom. Would you like to start?
Yeah, well, we've come a medium way in my lifetime. In 1970 or 1980, if you read a textbook on American history, it would in fact be largely the history of great white men, and it would be a story of the founding of a country dedicated to the principle that all men were created equal. But it would largely leave out the story of the people who weren't treated equally and the people without a voice. Beginning in the 1970s, there was this great effort undertaken. It became a movement of its own. They called it history from the bottom up, and in many different ways, it's to capture the voices of the people who didn't hold the reins of power, but who made things work. African Americans, slaves, Native Americans, immigrants, women, people who were the afterthoughts of history, each developed around each of these themes. A group of historians developed, very large, I think, around the country, and they began to promote the study of each of these groups to great effect. It's still going on. This is an ongoing effort. And the textbook creators and classroom teachers gradually said, yeah, these stories are important and we better incorporate them. And we're in a middle stage of this. Right now, if you go get an American history textbook, you'll find that there are sidebar stories about Native Americans, and that issues of race will be covered, and there'll be a wonderful story about Sojourner Truth. But the history of all of us is not told in one story. It's still largely a master narrative with a lot of sidebar stories to it. What we are trying to work toward, and it's a hard thing to do, is to tell the story of many different peoples coming together and in the tension of their competing interests and power struggles, a pretty impressive nation was forged. And it's still, it's never been perfect. It'll never be perfect. But it strives toward a concept. It holds as an ideal a world where all of us live together fairly, freely, and equally. We haven't gotten there. We may never get there. But we need to tell the story as a story of one people that incorporates many peoples.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to know? Okay. I'm inclined to reflect periodically on the words of William Shakespeare when he said the past is prologue. Mm-hmm. And I take that to mean that which has happened in the past has an effect on the future. As I examined American history for all the years that I did prior to, I believe it was 2007, when Eric Metaxas wrote his book, Amazing Grace, the story of William Wilberforce. Mm-hmm. As I looked at all the documentaries, read all the books, and thought about the Civil War, I could not help but also recall an expression that we use in the fire service very often, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So what I started to do was, and I'm just going to add one more side of this, the wording, I can't remember exactly, but at one point, Robin Williams played, the late Robin Williams played in a movie called Dead Poets Society. And he stood on his desk and he looked at his classroom and he asked everyone, he said, "What am I doing?" In essence, he said, I can't say verbatim what he said, but they just looked, in confusion, didn't know what he was driving at. He said, "I'm reminding you to constantly change your perspective." So with that in mind, what I did was I set out to analyze why it is that England and all of the colonies of England was able to end slavery in 1833, but it took until 1863 for the Emancipation Proclamation to be signed and a civil war to end slavery. Now, I've heard different figures, but it's 650, 750,000 men dying. I guess what I'm trying to say is when I analyze history, I not only look for inspiration, but I look for a way to prevent some things that are preventable. Otherwise, we end up, as they say, reliving the negative past.
Thank you. Thank you. Madelyn?
I think you just can't forget. I mean, I think when you read a book like, Esmeralda Santiago, when she wrote When I Was Puerto Rican, I mean, such a powerful book about her journey from Puerto Rico to New York and her mother, and, but she's written several books since, but, she's no longer that little girl that came from Puerto Rico and was poor and lived in New York in a housing project. I mean, she went on to become, a great writer and, her own family and probably, affluent, but I would bet she never forgot, and she doesn't forget.
So we're going to turn it now to Q&A, and hopefully you'll be within reach of a mic, and we'll just share a question or two or a comment. Certainly, there's so much more to talk about.
We are fortunate we're retired and have been going to a lot of museums. And when I come out of a museum, I find something interesting. I would get back to, we have a trailer, I go back to our trailer and I log on and Google it, and then get Wikipedia is always the first thing that pops up. I'm going to read about somebody I saw in the museum. What do the panelists think of Wikipedia as a history?
It's getting better all the time. If you had asked this 5 years ago, I said very untrustworthy, and in some things, it is still very untrustworthy. For most things, it gets a lot of it right. The problem with Wikipedia is that it truly is a democratic knowledge base, but it's constantly being, there are a lot of people out there sort of policing the part that McCullough said. You can't make it up, right? There are facts, and in some cases in Wikipedia, the facts are distorted. But sooner or later it catches up, it gets sifted out. I often start with Wikipedia, but I'll go to other places. I seek verification from many different sources. The danger with the web is one person says something and it gets on Wikipedia, then somebody else reads Wikipedia, repeats it, and you can find 5 corroborations of a completely spurious story by shifting around. So,
Which takes us right to your project about rumor.
yeah, exactly. Well, the web and rumor, yeah, don't go there. It'll never end. It's a good starter source. I would never take it as gospel. I'd take it as a beginning. What I most like is that you go to the museum, you are curious, you come home, ask the question. And then ask, if you read the Wikipedia story, and it takes you to another question, follow that one. Sooner or later, you'll have the understanding of your subject, even if Wikipedia was totally wrong.
Any other responses to the question about Wikipedia?
Yes, I'd like to. One of the things that I try to tell everyone is, when I'm teaching them anything about history, or actually through my program, it's called the Tools of Learning once again, As I tell them, in the 5th tool, it actually says, know their contributions. If a person's name is mentioned by your teacher in the classroom, write the name down. You don't have to read an entire book on them, but go to a source and look up some information on them. But the point that I try to tell them is this: don't rely on one source. Use at least 3. And I use the example of the fire service. When firefighters respond to a hazardous material incident, they don't rely on one source. If you do that, you can make a terrible mistake. You rely on 3 different sources, and then you say, well, they agree with one another, now we can proceed safely. So that's what I tell people. Wikipedia, I guess, as long as you're using it in conjunction with 2 other sources.
It's a source. I mean, I think when I see 3rd graders, you know, using Google Docs, you know, I mean, it's a Google world. I mean, you know, Wikipedia is one piece of it.
I think the point, too, about the democratic nature of Wikipedia, that it is this people's history, and it's fluid and it's static, and in some ways, just because a history is bound between two covers doesn't make it any more reliable necessarily. We have seen the ways in which stories have been incomplete, but certainly as a source and as a portal, it's a place that many people can get to, and I think accessibility is always a question in terms of how we learn, but it's always pulling on the thread. Where will it take you, and what else might you learn? But it comes back to the power of the question. Yeah. You want to know more, and it's that curiosity and that hunger.
If we truly want to have a participatory history, we have to allow for things like Wikipedia to let people of different viewpoints and with different knowledge collaborate on the creation of history. But we've also got to look to other sources to verify it, because the problem is that, and it's a great problem throughout history today, people with agendas get on and try to hijack facts to serve their purposes. That's where Wikipedia can sometimes lead us astray.
Lois, we have a question here.
Oh, yes, 2 questions.
Okay. My question has to do, it ties in with one of the first statements where you were worried about students not learning history in school and also in the museums. I work with some juniors in high school in Hartford, several different schools. During our introductions, they didn't even know the name of the neighborhood they lived in, like Frog Hollow, and they didn't know the history of the neighborhood and why it might be called that. So there is a huge disconnect, and this, where I wanted to take this was with museums and the opportunity for continuing education and really engaging Hartford students again. Coltsville and the National Park, do you see it as a huge opportunity? Do you see it actually having multiple narratives and current relevant topics, or is it just going to be like a gun museum?
If it's a gun museum, then it has failed, and we have failed. We as a city have failed.
Could you just provide us a little bit more context?
Oh, sure. About 3 blocks from here is the Colt factory, the firearms factory that Samuel Colt and his wife Elizabeth Jarvis Colt built into one of the largest weapons production industries in America in the mid and later 19th century. It was a factory to which they imported, they went to Europe and sought skilled laborers. They brought precision tool workers from Switzerland, and they built Swiss houses down there for them. It's a complex that really shows on the ground the industrial history of America in the second half of the 19th century. It's an amazing place. It recently was made, after years of work, a national park, and it will be developed. Over the next 5 years into, I think, the 2nd national historic site in Connecticut. It's a great teaching tool. You can, and if it's just a gun factory, we lose the whole story. You see it when you're driving by on 91. It's the blue onion dome with the Colt on top of it. That whole complex is stunningly beautiful. I can't wait to get my classes here, because when we get to the Industrial Revolution, It's going to be class meets at the front door on Wednesday, and we're taking a walk. I can walk you through the place, and when you come out of it, you'll know about weapons production, precision tool manufacturing, immigration into Connecticut, paternalism in the factory, about the role of an incredibly amazing woman who, after her husband's death in the 1860s, continued to engineer this huge business. She's been largely downplayed in history, but her role is essential. I'm really dwelling on this, but there are stories like that all over Hartford. And I think if we could concentrate on the power of place to teach history more in schools, it would be a tremendous benefit to everyone who lives anywhere if they could see the history at home as part of the global village we live in.
Chief Teale?
A challenging topic, however. And the reason why I bring it to your attention from this perspective is because many people do not know this, but Capitol Avenue used to be known as Rifle Street, or Rifle Avenue.
Yep.
I stand corrected, right? Rifle Avenue. And that's because Sharp's Rifle Company was on that spot, or in the location where the Capitol building is, somewhere in that area. I think at one time, the city of Hartford used to teach history, local history, in the school system. I believe it ended in 1967. I actually have a copy of the book that was utilized to teach Hartford history. I remember my teacher, Mr. Hugo LaPenta, my favorite teacher, teaching us from that book, and he taught us about Admiral David Farragut and the USS Hartford and damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. I mean, you know, made history real. But the challenge that I see here is this. We need to tell the entire history, and from time to time, and I say it like this, and I know a lot of people are not going to agree with it. From the fire department's perspective, the Circus Fire Memorial is actually an apology from the Hartford Fire Department. We should have saved those lives. In many ways we could have. Prevention and suppression properly placed, we could have. What I'm simply saying is this. The truth needs to be told about Colt's firearms, Sharp's rifle, the Hartford Treaty, all of those things. And where necessary, if an apology should be made, make the apology, because unfortunately, not doing so just makes it worse.
If I could, I absolutely agree with that. Telling the story of history in a place doesn't mean telling a triumphalist, positive only story. Every place has warts, every place has uglinesses. We executed and convicted witches 200 yards from here, over and over again in the 17th century.
People identified or named as witches.
Yeah,
Right.
well.
Right. Characterized as.
Exactly, yeah. Well, they believed they were witches. They killed them just the same. These are stories that, if we only tell a positive story, we miss the teaching moment. It's that you can do bad things and learn from them and get better. That is that is the most important lesson of history. Not that you're great. You need the inspiration that you can strive for greatness. You need the recognition that you will fail and sometimes need to apologize.
I'd also add, too, that it's that sometimes we don't have all of the beautiful. It's not that the history isn't, that we haven't told explored the underbelly of it all, we haven't pulled out all the warts. It's that sometimes history is so much more beautiful and powerful and inspiring than we can imagine. But we got one particular kind of narrative. And so part of the restorative work is about bringing as much more of the story as possible. And in our lifetimes, we still won't get it all. But I think to the question about Wikipedia, to the question about teaching, maybe one of the persistent things that we should be asking is, what more is there to learn? How have we told the entire story? And maybe even that isn't a great place to pause, but it's what more is there that we should know? And so it's that curiosity. I think we have room for one more question. Yes.
Well, this really isn't a question, but
Or a comment.
Pardon me?
A
It's
question or a comment.
Yes. And actually picking up on Connecticut history being taught in schools. I just wanted to mention Michael Boyder's Connecticut Industry Mural. I've been working with Michael for the past couple of years, and it is made up of the 8 regions in Connecticut. Each of the panels stands 10 feet high and 5 feet wide. It represents 350 years of Connecticut history. Right now, we're working on trying to digitize the mural, and so that the kids could click on any one particular person in the mural, hear about the history. This goes back to the very beginnings of what happened in Connecticut. If anybody'd like to take a look at the mural, you can also find Michael's journey to create this mural, which took him 25 years. That's up on YouTube. Just go to look up Connecticut Industry Mural and you can find it there. If anybody knows how we can get the financing we need to make this digital piece, we've got some kids in Bloomfield that have actually already done something relative to the digitization of the mural. So it's a wonderful, wonderful piece, and I think it's just what we need. And I'll just add another side note. A second grader in Putnam was asked, how do you think a town is made? And the child put her hand up and she said, well, China makes everything. So they made it all and they just sent it over here. So this says something about, I think what you all have been saying is that we really need to let kids know about history, Connecticut history.
And the world in which they live, the worlds in which they live. Absolutely. I'd like to take this moment to thank the Hartford Public Library, the Connecticut Forum, our panelists, for a splendid conversation. Thank you.